Hebrews 12 verses 3-4. Consider him, strength for the weary soul. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Hebrews 12 verses 3-4 takes the weary believer from the race course to the cross, and from the cross to the inward battlefield of the soul. The writer has already gathered the great cloud of witnesses and urged the church to run with endurance. But now he does something even more searching. He turns our eyes from the testimony of the elders to the unparalleled suffering of the Son. The saints of old are weighty witnesses, but Christ is the supreme standard of comparison. The writer knows that spiritual drift does not usually begin with open renunciation. It often begins with inward exhaustion. The soul becomes toil-worn. The heart slackens. Hope begins to loosen its hold. And so the Spirit of God does not answer weary saints with diversion, but with Christ. He does not soothe them with shallow encouragement, but commands them to think deeply, carefully, and proportionately about the suffering Son. These verses teach that saving faith is maintained by a holy reckoning in which the believer's present afflictions are weighed against the incomparable endurance of Christ, so that the soul is kept from fainting under trial and strengthened to strive against sin even when the cost of perseverance grows severe. First, consider the calculus of Christ's endurance. The command is plain: consider him. The word is analogisaste. It means more than a passing thought. It means to reckon up, to weigh carefully, to make a due comparison. The believer is called to place his own sufferings beside Christ's and to judge them in that light. This is not the language of sentiment, but of sober spiritual reasoning. The writer is saying, in effect, bring your grief into the presence of his grief. Bring your contradiction into the presence of his contradiction. Bring your burden under the weight of his cross. Then reckon rightly. Calvin presses this with searching force. If the Son of God, whom all creatures ought to adore, willingly endured such fierce conflict, who are we to imagine that lesser trials release us from the path of obedience? That does not make our afflictions unreal. It brings them into their proper proportion. Christ was the brightness of God's glory, yet he endured contradiction from sinners. The word used here is antilogia, contradiction, gainsaying, hostile reproach. He who was worthy of worship received slander, rejection, reproach, and at last the shame of the cross. The one against whom no accusation could stand was surrounded by accusation. The Holy One endured the enmity of the unholy. To consider him, then, is to place our sorrow beneath a higher and truer scale, until our complaints are hushed by the majesty of his endurance. And this bears directly upon the situation of the Hebrews. They were under pressure from a hostile religious world. They were tempted to retreat into the old order of shadows because faithfulness to Christ had become costly. The one they were tempted to forsake was the very one who had endured far greater contradiction in order to secure them. He had not borne one sharp word, but a whole storm of adversarial opposition. Yet he did not draw back. He did not count obedience too costly. He endured. So the first work of faith in this passage is this careful reckoning, to weigh our lesser sufferings against the greater sufferings of Christ, and in that reckoning to find both rebuke and strength. Second, consider the prevention of spiritual collapse. The writer then gives the purpose of this command, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. Here he lays open the inward anatomy of discouragement. Grow weary is komete, to become tired, spent, toil-worn. Lose heart is ekluminoi, to collapse inwardly, to become unstrung, to loosen under the strain. Ancient writers use such language of an athlete who falls down after the race, utterly spent. That is the image. The danger is not minor discomfort. It is inward collapse beneath prolonged strain. The writer's remedy is deeply instructive. He does not tell them to think less, but to think more truly. He does not tell them to stare at their pain until it becomes manageable. He tells them to consider Christ until pain is no longer sovereign in the judgment of the soul. Weariness, in Hebrews, is never merely emotional. It is theological. It has to do with what the heart is treating as most substantial. When moods, pressures, disappointments, and visible losses begin to seem more solid than the suffering and triumph of Christ, the soul starts to sink. When the seen becomes weightier than the unseen, when present strain seems more decisive than Christ's accepted suffering, then discouragement begins to gather strength. This is why one form of shadow worship is so dangerous. The heart begins to assign ultimate reality to what can be felt, counted, measured, and feared. Circumstances swell. The conscience becomes governed by inward weather. The sorrow of the moment begins to eclipse the glory of the mediator. The result is not merely sadness. It is fainting. The soul loses its firmness because it has ceased to reckon by the true standard. And so the Spirit says, "Consider him, lest ye be wearied. Look long, lest the heart sag. Think steadily, lest the will unravel." The cure for fainting is not lighter doctrine, but deeper and truer Christ-centered meditation. Yet Christ is not set before us here as mere pattern. He is also power. Hebrews has already named him the pioneer and perfecter of faith. So when the church is told to consider him, she is not being sent merely to admire an example, but to draw near, by faith, to the living mediator whose finished work and present session secure grace for weary saints. The Spirit uses this contemplation as a means of real strengthening. The soul is not upheld by self-generated resolve. It is upheld by the efficacy of Christ's obedience, the acceptance of his suffering, and the continuance of his priestly ministry. The weary believer is not merely told to think better thoughts. He is summoned to the one whose accepted suffering and present reign are able to keep him from falling into despair. Third, consider the standard of martyr striving. Verse 4 sharpens the exhortation with a sober rebuke. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. The writer does not deny that these believers have suffered. He does not treat their pain lightly, but he does correct their perspective. Not yet means their trial is real, but it has not yet reached the final extremity. It also implies that such extremity may still come. Martyrdom is not dismissed as impossible. The church must therefore learn humility and sobriety together. It must not exaggerate its present troubles into the severest trial imaginable, and neither must it imagine that severe suffering could never be required. But the most searching phrase here is your struggle against sin. The language is vigorous, struggling, wrestling, contending against sin. And the verb resisted is antigetestete. You have stood against, resisted, opposed. Yet this resistance has not reached mekris haimatus, unto blood, to the point of bloodshed. The writer is not speaking lightly. He is naming the conflict as a real contest, even a combat, but he is also reminding them that the farthest boundary has not yet been crossed. Calvin is especially helpful here. When the ungodly persecute believers for Christ's sake, believers are then contending against sin. The trial is not morally neutral. It is not merely an uncomfortable event. It is a battlefield. The outward pressure is trying to produce inward surrender. The sin in view is not only indwelling corruption in the abstract, but specifically the temptation to let go of Christ, to yield to unbelief, to draw back into apostasy under pressure. The struggle is therefore twofold. It is against the sin that still dwells within, and against the sin that presses from without. Fear of man, love of ease, bitterness, self-pity, unbelief, and the temptation to retreat all gather in this conflict. That means persecution is never just about pain. It is about allegiance. Will I cling to Christ or yield to sin? Will I endure reproach, or will I make peace with unbelief? Will I continue under pressure, or will I call retreat wisdom? The writer's rebuke is therefore merciful. He is telling them that their suffering must be read rightly. They are not merely the victims of unfortunate circumstances. They are in a holy conflict. They are striving against sin. And if they have not yet resisted unto blood, then they must not speak as though the farthest boundary has already been reached. There is also here a quiet rebuke of self-pity. Their goods may have been plundered. Their names may have been reproached. Their place in the community may have become painful. But they have not yet bled. Christ has. The martyrs have. Others before them have borne heavier costs. This does not trivialize their pain. It restores perspective. It teaches the soul that suffering for Christ must not be read as singular abandonment. Before the writer speaks in the next section of fatherly discipline, He first teaches them to interpret affliction as part of the conflict in which sin is being mortified and perseverance is being proved. Reflections for today. These verses speak with particular force because many believers today are not shedding blood, but they are growing tired. They are worn down by quiet griefs, repeated disappointments, inward battles, family burdens, social pressures, and the slow abrasion of life in a world that trains the heart to live by sight. In such seasons, a dangerous illusion begins to creep in. The soul whispers, "No one is borne a burden like mine. No one understands this strain. No one knows this weariness." Hebrews 12 verses 3-4 enters that darkness and commands a better reckoning. Consider him. Compare carefully. Judge under the light of Christ. The one whom you confess endured contradiction from sinners beyond all your measure, and he endured it not only as pattern, but as Redeemer. That means the Christian answer to discouragement is not denial, nor mere diversion, nor the management of mood. It is Christward recollection. It is bringing the soul, again and again, beneath the gospel history of the suffering Son until private sorrows are no longer treated as supreme. It is allowing the cross to rebuke self-pity without crushing tenderness. It is learning that the one who was opposed by his own people, slandered by the religious world, mocked, rejected, and crucified knows the weight of contradiction more deeply than any of his saints ever will. The one you may be tempted to question is the very one who endured far worse to keep you his own. These verses also expose the moral seriousness of suffering. Trials do not come merely to make life difficult. They press upon faith. They test allegiance. They ask whether unbelief will ripen, whether fear of man will govern, whether bitterness will spread, whether apostasy will begin to look reasonable, whether love of ease will outweigh love to Christ. That is why the Christian must not approach affliction as though it were only an inconvenience to be survived. It is a spiritual contest. The battle is moral, covenantal, and eternal in its implications. Therefore, the answer cannot be mere coping. It must be holy endurance, sustained by the accepted suffering and present priesthood of Christ. This also teaches the church to sober its expectations. Many faint because they had not counted the cost of endurance. They assumed faithfulness would remain socially manageable, emotionally tolerable, and largely safe. But "not yet unto blood" means that blood may yet come. Whether the cost is exclusion, misunderstanding, reproach, loss, or something more severe, the church must be taught that costly perseverance is not abnormal Christianity. It is ordinary Christianity under a crucified Lord. Yet the note of this passage is not despair. The soul is not sent back into itself. It is sent to Christ. He endured. He was accepted. He is seated. His suffering was received as final atonement. His present session is the anchor of the believer's perseverance. So the weary saint is not told, "Strengthen yourself by your own resolve." He is told, "Consider him more truly." Let the sufferings of Christ become the scale by which your own sufferings are read. Let his accepted sacrifice answer the accusations of your conscience. Let his priestly reign minister strength to you in the hour when your own strength is spent. This is how the soul is kept from sinking into the shadows of despair. And when the soul feels near collapse, let it remember that the Christ who endured such hostility is not only the supreme pattern of perseverance, but the living high priest whose accepted suffering and present intercession are sufficient for all his weary people. Amen.